Continuing Aemilius Paulus, from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. For when Antonius rebelled against Domitian, and Rome was in consternation, expecting great wars from the quarter of Germany, all on a sudden, and nobody knows upon what account, the people spontaneously gave out a rumor of victory, and the news ran current through the city that Antonius himself was slain, his whole army destroyed, and not so much as a part of it escaped. Nay, this belief was so strong and positive that many of the magistrates offered up sacrifice. But when, at length, the author was sought for, and none was to be found, it vanished by degrees, every one shifting it off from himself to another, and at last was lost in the numberless crowd, as in a vast ocean, and having no solid ground to support its credit, was in a short time not so much as named in the city. Nevertheless, when Domitian marched out with his forces to the war, he met with messengers and letters that gave him a relation of the victory, and the rumor, it was to be found, had come the very day it was gained. Through the distance between the places was more than 2,500 miles. The truth of this no man of our time is ignorant of, and I'm trying not to give the relation. It's a T, and it keeps that T pronunciation in the Latin of that period. In English we go to chun and that sort of stuff. It's like Goetia, for example. It's not Quisha or any of that. But proceed. Cnaeus Octavius, who was joined in command with Aemilius, came to an anchor with his fleet under Samothrace, where, out of respect to what he considered to be divinities, he permitted Perseus to enjoy the benefit of refuge, but took care that he should not escape by sea, notwithstanding Perseus secretly persuaded Oroendes of Crete, master of a small vessel, to convey him and his treasure away. He, however, playing the true Cretan, took in the treasure, and bade him come in the night with his children and most necessary attendants to the port by the temple of Ceres, but which now isn't that like a planetoid that they've named. But as soon as it was evening, set sail, or is it a moon? I forget. As soon as it was evening, set sail without him. It had been sad enough for Perseus to be forced to let down himself, his wife, and children through a narrow window by a wall, people altogether unaccustomed to hardship and flying. But that which drew a far sadder sigh from his heart was, when he was told by a man, as he wandered on the shore, that he had seen Oroendes under the sail in the main sea, it being now about daybreak. So, there being no hopes left of escaping, he fled back again to the wall, which he and his wife recovered, though they were seen by the Romans. Before they could reach them, his children he himself had delivered into the hands of Ion, one that had been his favorite, but now proved his betrayer, and was the chief cause that forced him, beasts themselves will do so when their young ones are taken, to come and yield himself up to those that had them in their power. The greatest confidence was in Nasica, and it was for him he called, but he not being there, he bewailed his misfortune, and seeing there was no possible remedy, surrendered himself to Octavius, and here in particular he made it manifest that he was possessed with a vice more sordid than covetousness itself, namely the fondness of life, by which he deprived himself even of pity, the only thing that fortune never takes away from the most wretched. He desired to be brought to Aemilius, who arose from his seat, and, accompanied with his friends, went to receive him, with tears in his eyes, as a great man fallen by the anger of what he considered to be gods and goddesses, and his own ill fortune, when Perseus, the most shameful of sights, threw himself at his feet, embraced his knees, and uttered unmanly cries and petitions, such as Aemilius was not able to hear, nor would vouchsafe to hear, but looking on him with a sad and angry countenance, he said, Why, unhappy man, do you thus take pains to exonerate fortune of your heaviest charge against her, by conduct that will make it seem like you are not unjustly in calamity, and that it is not your present condition, but your former happiness, that was more than your deserts, and why depreciate also my victory, and make my conquests insignificant, by proving yourself a coward, and a foe beneath a Roman? Distress valor challenges great respect, even from enemies, but cowardice, though never so successful, from the Romans, has always met with scorn. Yet for all this he took him up, gave him his hand, and delivered him into the custody of Tibero. Meantime he himself carried his sons-in-law, and others of chief rank, especially of the younger sort, back with him into his tent, where for a long time he sat down without speaking one word, insomuch that they all wondered at him. At last he began to discourse of fortune and human affairs. Is it meet, said he, for him that knows he is but man, in his greatest prosperity, to pride himself, and be exalted at the conquest of a city, nation, or kingdom, and not rather well to weigh this change of fortune, in which all warriors may see an example of their common frailty, and learn a lesson that there is nothing durable or constant? Sort of the Roman version of Buddhism, right? For what time can the printing's off. For what time can men select to think themselves secure, when that of victory itself forces us more than any to dread our own fortune, the very little consideration on the law of things, and how all are hurried round, and each man's station changed, will introduce sadness into the midst of the greatest joy? Or can you, when you see before your eyes the succession of Alexander himself, who arrived at the height of power and ruled the greatest empire in the short space of an hour trodden underfoot, when you behold a king that was but even now surrounded with so numerous an army, receiving nourishment to support his life from the hands of his conquerors, can you, I say, believe there is any certainty in what we now possess, whilst there is such a thing as chance? No, young men, cast off that vain pride and empty boast of victory. Sit down with humility, looking always for what is yet to come, and the possible future reverses, which the divine displeasure may eventually make the end of our present happiness. It is said that Aemilius, having spoken much more to the same purpose, dismissed the young men properly humbled, and with their vainglory and insolence thoroughly chastened and curbed by his address. And yeah, if you make it just about a physical conquering, there's going to be some issues involved in the but if you conquer with ideas and you have principles about what you're doing, not just making the empire great and piling up wealth of the soldiers and generals and stuff, then maybe you'll have something that lasts. But everything else, because Alexander the Great, he was the greatest at it, and look what has happened to his empire. When this was done, he put his army into garrisons to refresh themselves, and went himself to visit Greece, and to spend a short time in relaxations equally honorable and humane. Well, the Alexandria cultural centers did more to preserve a Greek influence, though, but for as he passed, he eased the people's grievances, reformed their governments, and bestowed gifts upon them. To some corn, grain, like probably barley or wheat or something like that, not. To others, oil out of the king's storehouses, in which they report there were such vast quantities laid up that receivers and petitioners were lacking before they could be exhausted. In Delphi he found a great square pillar of white marble, destined for the pedestal of King Perseus's golden statue, on which he commanded his own to be placed, alleging that it was but just that the conquered should give place to the conquerors. At Olympia he is said to have uttered the saying everybody has heard, that Phidias had carved Homer's Jupiter. When the 10 commissioners arrived from Rome, he delivered up again to the Macedonians their cities and country, granting them to live at liberty, and according to their own laws, only paying the Romans the tribute of 100 talents, double which sum they had been wont to pay to their kings. Then he celebrated all manner of shows and games, and sacrifices to the various entities considered to be gods and goddesses, and made great entertainments and feasts for the charge of all, which he liberally defrayed out of the king's treasury, and showed that he understood the ordering and placing of his guests, and how every man should be received answerably to their rank and quality, with such exactness that the Greeks were full of wonder, finding the care of these matters of pleasure did not escape him, and that, though involved in such important business, he could observe correctness in these trifles, nor was it least gratifying to him that amidst all the magnificent and splendorous preparations, he himself was always the most grateful sight, and greatest pleasure to those he entertained, and told those that seemed to wonder at his diligence, that there was the same spirit shown in marshalling a banquet as an army, in rendering the one formidable to the enemy, the other acceptable to the guests, nor did men less praise his liberality and the greatness of his soul than his other virtues, for he would not so much as see those great quantities of silver and gold which were heaped together out of the king's palaces, but delivered them to the quaestors to be put into the public treasury. He only permitted his own sons, who were great lovers of learning, to take the king's books, and when he distributed rewards due to extraordinary valor, he gave his son-in-law, Aemilius Paulus, a bowl that weighed 5 pounds. This is that Tubero we have already mentioned, who was one of 16 relations that lived together, and were all maintained out of one little farm. And it is said that this was the first plate that ever entered the house of the Alii, brought thither as an honor and reward of virtue. Before this time neither they nor their wives ever made use either of silver or gold. Having thus settled everything well, taking his leave of the Greeks, and exhorting the Macedonians that, mindful of the liberty they had received from the Romans, they should endeavor to maintain it by their obedience to the laws, and concord amongst themselves, he departed for Epirus, having orders from the Senate to give the soldiers that followed him in the war against Perseus the pillage of the cities of that country, that he might set upon them all at once by surprise and unawares. He summoned 10 of the principal men out of reach, whom he commanded on such an appointed day to bring all the gold and silver they had either in their private houses or temples, and with every one of these, as if it were for the very purpose, and under pretense of searching for and receiving the gold, he sent for a centurion and guard of soldiers, who, the set day being come, rose all at once, and the very self-same time fell upon them, and proceeded to ransack the cities, so that in 1 hour 150,000 persons were made slaves, and 70 cities sacked. Yet what was given to each soldier out of so vast a destruction and utter ruin amounted to no more than 11 drachmas, so that men could only shudder at the issue of a war, where the wealth of a whole nation, thus divided, turned to so little advantage and profit to each particular man. And when Aemilius had done this, an action perfectly contrary to his gentle and mild nature, he went down to Ricus, where he embarked his army for Italy. He sailed up the river Tiber in the king's galley, and had 16 bands of oars, and was richly adorned with captured arms and with cloths of purple and scarlet, so that the vessel, rowing slowly against the stream, the Romans crowded on the shore to meet him, had a foretaste of his following triumph. But the soldiers, who had cast a covetous eye on the treasures of Perseus when they did not obtain as much as they thought they deserved, were secretly enraged and angry with Aemilius for this, but openly complained that he had been a severe and tyrannical commander over them. Nor were they ready to show their desire for his triumph, when Servius Galba, who was Aemilius's enemy, though he commanded as tribune under him, understood this, that he had the boldness plainly to affirm that a triumph was not to be allowed him, and sowed various calumnies amongst the soldiers, when yet further increased their ill will. Nay, more, he desired the tribunes of the people, because the 4 hours that were remaining of the day could not suffice for the accusation, to let him put it off till another. When the tribunes commanded him to speak, then, if he had anything to say, he began a long oration, filled with all manner of reproaches, in which he spent the remaining part of the time. And the tribunes, when it was dark, dismissed the assembly. The soldiers, growing more vehement on this, thronged all to Galba, and entreating into a conspiracy, early in the morning beset the Capitol, where the tribunes had appointed the following assembly to be held. As soon as it was day, it was put to the vote, and the first tribe was proceeding to refuse the triumph, and the news spread amongst the people and of the Senate. The people were indeed much grieved that Aemilius should meet with such ignominy, but this was only in words, which had no effect. The chief of the Senate exclaimed against it as a base action, and excited one another to repress the boldness and insolence of the soldiers, which would ere long become altogether ungovernable and violent. Were they now permitted to deprive Aemilius of his triumph, forcing a passage through the crowd, they came up in great numbers, and desired the tribunes to differ polling till they had spoken what they had to say to the people. All things thus suspended, and silence being made, Marcus Servilius stood up, a man of consular dignity, and who had killed 23 of his enemies that he had challenged him in a single combat. It is now more than ever, said he, clear to my mind how great a commander our Aemilius Paulus is, when I see he was able to perform such famous and great exploits with an army so full of sedition and baseness. Nor can I sufficiently wonder that a people that seemed to glory in the triumphs over Illyrians and Ligurians should now, through envy, refuse to see the Macedonian king led alive, and all the glory of Philip and Alexander in captivity to the Roman power. For is it not such a strange thing for you, who, upon a slight rumor of victory, that came by chance into the city, did offer sacrifices and put up your requests unto entities, that you might see the report verified, now when the general is returned with an undoubted conquest, to defraud the entities of honor, and yourselves of joy, if you are feared to behold the greatness of his warlike deed, or were resolved to spare your enemy. And of the two, much better were it to put a stop to the triumph, out of pity to him, than out of the envy to your general. Yet to such a height of power is malice arrived amongst you, that a man without one scar to show on his skin, that is smooth and sleek with ease and home-keeping habits, will understand the divine office and duties of a general before us, who with our own wounds have been taught how to judge of the valor or cowardice of commanders. And at the same time, putting aside his garment, he showed an infinite number of scars upon his breast, and turning about he exposed some parts of his person which it is usual to conceal, and addressing Galba said, You deride me for these, in which I glory before my fellow citizens, for it is in their service which I have ridden night and day, that I receive them. But go collect the votes, whilst I follow after, and note the base and ungrateful, and such as choose rather to be flattered and courted than commanded by their general. It is said that speech so stopped the soldiers' mouths and altered their minds that all the tribes decreed a triumph for Aemilius, which was performed after this manner. And it's very important that a person does not fall to this stuff where, oh, when you want something, oh, when you get it, you kind of, or if it's good, if one's fortune is good, if one's fortune is bad, then you do your worship. But otherwise, you leave the whole thing alone. It's like, yeah, no, don't do that. Do the act for itself, and then you don't worry about the consequences per se. Now, you do regard consequences in your actions, but you know what I mean. The people erected scaffolds in the forum, in the circuses, as they call their buildings for horse races, and in all other parts of the city, where they could best behold the show. The spectators were clad in white garments, all the temples were open, and full of garlands and perfumes. The ways were cleared and kept open by numerous officers, who drove back all who crowded into or ran across the main avenue. This triumph lasted 3 days. On the first, which was scarcely long enough for the sight, were to be seen the statues, pictures, and colossal images, which were taken from the enemy, drawn upon 250 chariots. On the second was carried in a great many wagons the finest and richest armor of the Macedonians, both the brass and steel, all newly polished and glittering, the pieces of which were piled up and arranged purposely with the greatest art, so as to seem to be tumbled in heaps carelessly and by chance. Helmets were thrown upon shields, coats of mail upon greaves, Cretan targets, and Thracian bucklers, and quivers of arrows lay huddled amongst horses' bits, and through these there appeared the points of naked swords intermixed with long Macedonian sarissas. All these arms were fastened together with just so much looseness that they struck against one another as they were drawn along and made a harsh and alarming noise, so even as spoils of a conquered enemy, they could not be beheld without dread. After these wagons, loaded with armor, there followed 3,000 men, who carried the silver that was coined in 750 vessels, each of which weighed 3 talents, and was carried by 4 men. Others brought silver bowls and goblets and cups, and disposed in such order as to make the best show, and all curious as well for their size as the solidity of their embossed work. On the 3rd day, early in the morning, first came the trumpeters, who did not sound as they were wont in a procession or solemn entry, but such a charge as the Romans use when they encourage the soldiers to fight. Next followed young men, wearing frocks with ornamented borders, who led to the sacrifice 120 stalled oxen, with their horns gilded, and their heads adorned with ribbons and garlands. And with these were boys that carried basins for libation of silver and gold. After this was brought the gold coin, which was divided into vessels that weighed 3 talents, like those that contained the silver, and were in number 77. I wonder if that's the reason why Unicult has 77 repetitions of something. These were followed by those that brought the consecrated bowl, which Aemilius had caused to be made, that weighed 10 talents, and was set with precious stones. Then were exposed to view the cups of Antigonus and Seleucus, and those of Heraclean make, and all the gold plate that was used at Perseus's table. Next to these came Perseus's chariot, in which his armor was placed, and on that his diadem. And after a little intermission, the king's children were led captive, and with them a train of their attendants, masters, and teachers, all shedding tears and stretching out hands to the spectators, and making the children themselves also beg and entreat their compassion. There were 2 sons and a daughter, whose tender age made them but little sensible of the greatness of their misery, which very insensibly of their condition rendered it the more deplorable, insomuch that Perseus himself was scarcely regarded as he went along, whilst pity fixed the eyes of the Romans upon the infants, and many of them could not forbear tears, and all beheld the sight with a mixture of sorrow and pleasure, until the children were past. After his children and their attendants came to Perseus himself, clad all in black, wearing the boots of his country, and looking like one altogether stunned and deprived of reason through the greatness of his misfortunes. Next followed a great company of his friends and familiars, whose countenances were disfigured with grief, and who let the spectators see, by their tears and their continual looking upon Perseus, that it was his fortune they so much lamented, and that they were regardless of their own. Perseus sent to Aemilius to entreat that he might not be led in pomp, but be left out of the triumph, who, deriding as was but just his cowardice and fondness of life, sent him this answer, that as for that, it had been before and was now in his own power, giving him to understand that the disgrace could be avoided by death, which the faint-hearted man, not having the spirit for, and made effeminate by, I know not what hopes, allowed himself to appear as a part of his own spoils. After these were carried 400 crowns, all made of gold, sent from the cities by the respective deputations to Aemilius, in honor of his victory, which he himself came, seated on a chariot, magnificently adorned, a man well worthy to be looked on, even with these ensigns of power, dressed in a robe of purple interwoven with gold, and holding a laurel branch in his right hand, all the army in like manner, with boughs of laurel in their hands, divided into their bands and companies, followed the chariot of the commander, some singing verses according to the usual custom, mingled with raillery, others songs of triumph and praise of Aemilius's deeds, who indeed was admired and accounted happy by all men, and unenvied by every one that was good, except so far as it seems the province of some entity to lessen that happiness which is too great and inordinate, and so to mingle the affairs of human life, that no one should be entirely free and exempt from calamities. Now, it's interesting view, right? As we read in Homer, that those should think themselves truly blessed whom fortune has given an equal share of good and evil. Now, sometimes you don't know that humans will be like, oh, this guy needs taken down a notch. It's like, well, what if he's already taken down a notch? He's just not making a deal of it, right? Aemilius had 4 sons, of whom Scipio and Fabius, as is already related, were adopted into other families. The other 2, whom he had by a second wife, and who were yet but young, he brought up in his own house. One of these died at 14 years of age, 5 days before his father's triumph, the other at 12, 3 days after, so that there was no Roman without a deep sense of his suffering, and who did not shudder at the cruelty of fortune, that had not scrupled to bring so much sorrow into a house replenished with happiness, rejoicing and sacrifices, and to intermingle tears and laments with songs of victory and triumph. Well, accepting the good and bad of life and working with it is definitely important. Aemilius, however, reasoning justly that courage and resolution was not merely to resist armor and spears, but all the shocks of ill fortune, so met and so adapted himself to these mingled and contrasting circumstances as to outbalance the evil with the good, and his private concerns with those of the public, and thus did not allow anything either to take away from the grandeur or sully the dignity of his victory. For as soon as he had buried the first of his sons, as we have already said, he triumphed, and the second dying almost as soon as his triumph was over, he gathered together an assembly of the people and made an oration to them, not like a man that stood in need of comfort from others, but one that undertook to support his fellow citizens in their grief for the sufferings he himself underwent. I, said he, who never yet feared anything that was human, have amongst such as were divine, always had a dread of fortune, as faithless and inconsistent, and for the very reason that in this war she had been as a favorable gale in all my affairs, I still expected some change and reflux of things. In one day I passed the Ionian Sea and reached Corcyra from Brundisium. Thence in 5 more I sacrificed at Delphi, and in other 5 days came to my forces in Macedonia, where, after I had finished the usual sacrifices for purifying of the army, I entered on my duties, and in space of 15 days put an honorable period to the war, still retaining a jealousy of fortune even from the smooth current of my affairs, and seeing myself secure and free from the danger of any enemy. I chiefly dreaded the change of the female entity at sea, whilst conveying home my victorious army, vast spoils, and a captive king. Nay, indeed, after I returned to you safe, and saw the city full of joy, congratulating and sacrifices, yet still I distrusted, well knowing that fortune never conferred any great benefits that were unmixed and unattended with probabilities of reverse. Nor could my mind, that was still as it were in labor, and always foreseeing something to befall this city, free itself from this fear until this great misfortune befell me in my own family, until in the midst of those days set apart for triumph, I carried 2 of the best sons, my only destined successors, one after another, to their funerals. Now, therefore, I am myself safe from danger, at least as to what was my greatest care, and I trust and am verily persuaded that for the time to come fortune will prove constant and harmless unto you, since she has sufficiently wreaked her jealousy at our great success on me and mine, and has made the conqueror as marked an example of human instability as the captive whom he led in triumph, with this only difference, that Perseus, though conquered, does yet enjoy his children, while the conqueror, Aemilius, is deprived of this. This was the generous and magnanimous oration Aemilius is said to have spoken to the people, from a heart truly sincere and free from all artifice. Although he very much pitied the condition of Perseus, and studied to befriend him in what he was able, yet he could procure no other favor than his removal from the common prison, the carcer, into a more cleanly and humane place of security, where whilst he was guarded, it is said he starved himself to death. Others state his death to be of the strangest and most unusual character, that the soldiers who were his guard, having conceived a spite and hatred against him for some reason, and finding no other way to grieve and afflict him, kept him from sleep, and took pains to disturb him when he was disposed to rest, and found out contrivances to keep him continually awake, by which means at length he was utterly worn out and expired. 2 of his children also died soon after him. The third, who was named Alexander, they say proved an exquisite artist in turning and engraving small figures, and learned so perfectly to speak and write the Roman language that he became clerk to the magistrates and behaved himself in his office with great skill and conduct. They ascribed to Aemilius' conquest of Macedonia the most acceptable benefit to the people, that he brought so vast a quantity of money into the public treasury that they never paid any taxes until Hirtius and Pansa were consuls, which was in the first war between Antony and Caesar. This also was peculiar and remarkable in Aemilius, that though he was extremely beloved and honored by the people, yet he always sided with the nobles, nor would he either say or do anything to ingratiate himself with the multitude, but constantly adhered to the nobility in all political matters. which in after times was cast in Scipio Africanus's teeth by Appius. These two being in their time the most considerable men in the city, and standing in competition for the office of censor, the one had on his side the nobles and the senate, to which party the Appii were always attached. The other, although his own interest was great, yet made use of the favor and love of the people. When, therefore, Appius saw Scipio come into the marketplace, surrounded with men of mean rank, and such as were but newly made free, yet were very fit to manage a debate, to gather together the rabble, and to carry whatsoever they designed by importunity and noise, crying out with a loud voice, "Groan now," said he, "O Aemilius Paulus, if you have knowledge in your grave of what is done above, that your son aspires to be censor, by the help of Aemilius, the common crier, and Licinius, Philonicus, Scipio always had the goodwill of the people, because he was constantly heaping favors on them. But Aemilius, though he still took part with the nobles, yet was as much the people's favorite as those who most sought popularity, and used every art to obtain it. This they made manifest when, amongst other dignities, they thought him worthy of the office of censor, a trust accounted most sacred and of great authority, as well in other things as in the strict examination into men's lives, for the censors had power to expel a senator, and enroll whom they judged most fit in his room, and to disgrace such young men as lived licentiously, and by taking away their horses. Besides this, they were to value and assess each man's estate, and register the number of the people. There were numbered by Aemilius 347,452 men. He declared Marcus Aemilius Lepidus first senator, who had already 4 times held that honor, and he removed from their office 3 of the senators of the least note. The same moderation he and his fellow censor Marcius Philippus used to muster of the knights. Whilst he was thus busy about many and weighty affairs, he fell sick of a disease which at first seemed hazardous, and although after a while it proved without danger, yet was troublesome and difficult to be cured, so that the advice of physicians